Hello, and welcome to the first SimVenture webinar. My name is Keith Smith. I'm the founder of Pilot Edge, and today we're going to be discussing how to use flight sims effectively, focused primarily at real-world pilots. There's going to be a lot of information. We're going to try and move as quickly as we can. So some quick housekeeping, what we're going to cover. Be a quick introduction and reviewing the upcoming webinar schedule. We'll review who the target audience is for this presentation. And at a high level, we're going to cover what you stand to gain from simulation, some of the perceived and actual pitfalls of using simulators. And then we're going to walk through, at the end, some best practices, generally speaking, for primary training and for instrument training. And then we will wrap it up. So this is the first of 4 SimVenture webinars. It's the first time we're doing them. SimVenture was started a few years ago during COVID, actually, and is powered by the Pilot Edge network. And SimVenture is a 4-day online event that seeks to replicate EAA's world-famous AirVenture experience. It's been widely regarded as an excellent way to prepare for the AirVenture experience. And for the first time this year, we are partnering with 4Flight. I should say it's the first time out of all the SimVentures that we've partnered with 4Flight to include this brand new webinar series. So these are taking place immediately following each of the day's flying activities, and today is day 1. So a quick look ahead. Here we are on Thursday night talking about how to use flight sims effectively as a real-world pilot. Tomorrow night we'll be looking at what's new in 4Flight. That's being presented by Ryan McBride. On Saturday, we have a live Q&A with Dave and Kathy called Ask an Oshkosh Controller. That one should actually be a hoot. And then on Sunday, we actually have Austin Meyer himself coming to talk about X-Plane. Not too surprising on that topic. All right, keeping it moving, let's talk about the target audience for this presentation. So we are looking at student and private pilots who are considering the use of a home simulator. So these are people who are on the fence or watching from the outside and have not yet pulled the trigger on using a home simulator. And then we're going to look at pilots who are using a simulator and are either baffled, confounded, or otherwise frustrated by their home simulator experience, of which there are thousands of people. And lastly, this one's not so obvious, we are interested in reaching out to simulator enthusiasts, as those represent a pretty large pool of potential future pilots. So trying to catch those folks while they're still at the enthusiast stage, this is an opportunity to focus their simulation experiences a little bit more in a way that might help prepare them for their real-world training and save them a ton of money in the process. Okay, so this is an odd way to approach this topic, but bear with me for a second. We're going to talk about the benefit of experience. This is going to drive a lot of the motivation for getting your experience with simulation correct. So if we look at the benefit of experience, let's look at the mindset and the experience levels of, first and foremost, a student pilot. So a student pilot is typically saying to themselves, what just happened 5 minutes ago? There's a general level of panic and confusion, having blinders on, probably staring at their airspeed, VSI, or altimeter, not really looking outside the window, and just generally being behind the airplane and hanging on for dear life. Absolutely common for the student pilot. Moving on, we have the newly minted private pilot or instrument pilot, and they're just a step ahead of the game. They're at least saying, wait, what just happened? At least they're not 5 minutes behind. And at the front of the line, we have the prototypical airline transport pilot who's more concerned about what sort of cookies they have in the hotel lobby or the condition of the crew bus, or pick your favorite ATP joke. These are all pilots, all with different experience levels, and their mindset and level of experience are radically different. So the quest then, or the goal, is to see how we can reach that ATP level of performance. Presumably most pilots are trying to get better, even if you're not intending to become a commercial or ATP pilot. There's always the pursuit of excellence and improving your performance as a pilot. So how do you go about reaching ATP levels of performance? There's really not much getting around it. You need to acquire many hours of relevant experience. There's a great reason that the word relevant is in capital letters there. you need to build a ton of experience. And hours in a logbook really don't necessarily translate to relevant experience. So I would say logbook, schmogbook, um, and worry a lot less about the logging of time. That'll become important later when we talk about simulators, and focus more about what are you building in terms of your body of experience. So you can build your experience in a couple of different ways. You can build it in the airplane, the traditional way, or you could use a simulator. It's your call. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the benefits then of using a simulator, assuming that it could be used to meet that goal of building relevant experience. So on the obvious side, it lets you explore your limitations in a low-risk environment. When we say low-risk environment, what does that specifically mean? Well, it means you're not going to die, which is ideal. Definitely one of the better benefits of a simulator is not dying. So on the obvious side, we talk about different sorts of limitations that exist. We can break that down into some practical examples of what those limitations might be. So on the weather side, you can explore your limitations with regards to crosswinds, visibility, and even turbulence. And I know that sounds a little bit funny given that you're in a non-motion home sim. Uh, with enough turbulence, there's still enough distraction and workload generated. Yes, you don't have the movement in the seat, but there's still a additional workload associated with dealing with turbulence. On the performance side, you can explore limitations regarding density altitude, a fore or aft CG, either approaching or exceeding those limits. You can explore what happens when you start approaching fuel limitations in terms of fuel starvation and the pressure that comes from that as you start approaching as you start trying to do max range profiles, for example, and you hit the limits of your fuel reserves. And then there is your performance when you're dealing with aircraft system failures, be it engines or flight controls or automation or radios, what have you. Continuing on, we can also look at your workload. So we can be increasing your weather limitations, performance limitations, but slightly less obvious is the is workload. I've personally noticed this. During flights in the sim, there are times when I'm clearly very relaxed, there are times when I'm quite busy, and there are times where I'm just past my level of capability and the wheels start coming off. That is an incredibly powerful experience to have and best had in the simulator. So with regards to workload, we can look at equipment failures. Those are a great way to bring on more workload. On the instrument side, something like a last minute change of approach where your flow is interrupted and you're unable to just proceed through your usual steps and processes. So there's a wrench in the works, you get, say, a different approach or a different runway or a circling approach. All of that can slowly bring the workload up. And then, of course, a diversion would achieve much the same thing. Another fairly obvious benefit to simulation is the cost efficiency. So if we look at what $179 gets you in an airplane when you're a primary or instrument student, it's probably about 45 minutes worth of flight time. Whereas in a simulator, that can pay for the better part of your electricity, which is really the only variable part of running the sim, and some additional services. So for example, Pilot Edge costs about $179 a year, which is a happy coincidence for this presentation. I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but honestly, the cost savings from using a simulator on a per-hour basis compared to a real-world airplane are literally comical. So it should be obvious, but in case it wasn't, there is a massive cost efficiency to be realized by using a simulator. Let's look at a slightly less obvious set of benefits. There is the time efficiency of using a simulator. When we look at using a flight simulator, at least in my personal experience, if I have a 1 hour block of time to work and do some flight training at home, I can be productive, honestly, for about 55 minutes of that block of time. So if you started a timer from the time I started till the time I finished, after 1 hour of elapsed time, I would have done probably about 55 minutes of training. A couple of minutes of planning while I am simultaneously loading up the simulator, selecting the airport, setting up the weather, etc. And then boom, I'm in the cockpit and the training begins. Compare that to a real-world airplane. I wish I had more time to belabor this point because it really is astounding how much more efficient it is to be using a simulator compared to an airplane. But 1 hour door to door, assuming it takes you some time to drive to the airport, you really cannot achieve much in an airplane. I don't think I need to beat a dead horse on that one, but there is a massive time efficiency to be realized by using a simulator at home. Partially because of the convenience, and also because there are certain steps you simply do not have to do with regards to briefing the flight, pre-flighting the airplane, to say nothing of the steps within the simulator that you may elect to consciously skip compared to things that you would not be able to skip in the airplane, such as a run-up, for example, or even taxi. So suffice to say, time efficiency is probably not something that springs to mind. Everyone picks the cost efficiency, but fewer people seem to talk about the time efficiency. There's also the convenience factor of the time of day. I live in northern New Jersey, and in the winter time at 11 p.m., the single last place I'd like to be is in the hangar trying to open the door and pull out the airplane. I cannot think of anything more miserable and cold than that, except maybe being in Minnesota. So the fact that I can train at 11 p.m. on a January evening here in the comfort of the house is a really good example of how convenient a sim can be. And on the not obvious at all front, using a simulator allows you to achieve mastery of a really wide set of skills that would otherwise cost you a massive fortune to acquire in real life. And that is not an exaggeration. I won't read through every one of those things, but if you take your time, feel free to pause it and look through and think about all those things. The time it would take to achieve mastery of those things in the airplane is well beyond what most people are able to afford, and certainly what they cover during their primary and instrument training. Yet every one of those things in that list represents a really important skill. This isn't just esoteric hand-picked things like a through clearance or a cruise clearance, something you almost never receive. These are no kidding things you're going to hit during your flying. And there really isn't that much time to get to achieve mastery of these skills during your private and instrument training. Okay, so we've talked about all the theoretical benefits of using the simulator. Chances are, if you're watching this presentation, there's a good chance you're already interested in simulation, so I will leave it at that in terms of the benefits of simulation. So assuming you're in, you probably want to know what's next. So what do we do now? We are going to review the perceived pitfalls of using a sim, the actual pitfalls of using simulators, and then we're going to try and breeze through best practices as quickly as I can, broken up into general best practices, and then focusing on primary and instrument, and then we will wrap it up. Okay, let's look at the perceived pitfalls and limitations of using a simulator. This is based on my perceptions from the last 20 or 30 years of being involved in this industry, and it is improving. I will say every now and then I take stock of where things are at, and I do not necessarily hear this one as much. It seems like the sentiment is changing somewhat, but I still do run into plenty of curmudgeons who think that that old PC ATD sitting at the flight school that's covered in dust, that is no longer certified, that has a terrible visual system, really a terrible everything. With good reason, they believe that simulators are only good for instrument training. And the reality is that desktop simulation has moved leaps and bounds since those very primitive devices from the early 90s, for example, 90s through 2000s. And there is truly a lot more you can do in a simulator other than just shooting approaches and holding. There is a fixation on emergencies. So anyone who's flown in one of those 1990s era PC ATDs probably did a lot of it under partial panel. So there became a perception that when you're in a simulator, you should be practicing non-standard and emergency procedures. True, sims are useful for those things, but they are also useful for mastering normal operations as well. There's a perception that the flight dynamics are terrible because the simulated airplane does not fly like your personal airplane. And I've hammered on this point over the years, but this joystick that I'm holding in my hand doesn't get exposed to the same um, real-world physics and airflow that the flight controls of a Cessna 172 experience at 120 knots. So unless you have an incredibly expensive control loading system that will help to simulate some of the dynamic resistance in the flight controls, your typical home simulator is going to feel different. The good news is that pushing forward still makes the ground bigger, and pulling back gives you a good view of the sky, at least for a short period of time, and that left is left and right is right. Similar to the car that you drive at home is not the same as the car that you rent when you go on vacation. And so the brake response, the throttle response, the steering response are all different. And yet I have never met an adult driver who's gone on vacation and has thrown their hands in the air and said, I can't drive this car. It feels different than my car at home. Most drivers with any sense of perception and ability are able to adjust their driving within the first 3 or 4 seconds of driving a rental car. And the same is really true for Sims. So I think it's not an issue of physical ability necessarily. It's an expectation that pilots have and a sensitivity that pilots have. They're already thinking the simulator is going to be a game or is going to be terrible. And so the minute the flight controls feel different than their airplane, they're like, see, I told you it doesn't fly like my airplane. There's a perception that you shouldn't bother taxiing or even landing in some sims because the flight controls are so bad. And in fact, that is not true. There is simulators are at the point where the visual systems are good enough. The integration with EFBs is great, where you can actually have georeferenced plates and practice that incredibly important skill of taxiing at a busy, unfamiliar airport, because that's something that pilots have to do from time to time. And there's a perception that using a simulator at home is going to lead to bad habits. That is potentially true. In fact, using me as an example, I absolutely fell into the same bad habit that every primary student who uses the sim at home without supervision falls into, and that is, say it with me if you're a flight instructor, instrument fixation. I do wonder if you can put in the comments what everyone actually said. That would be helpful. But yes, you can learn bad habits. However, if you then approach your flight training with an open mind and your CFI is aware of what it is that you've been self-studying or training, they can set an expectation that, hey, you may have to undo a couple of things. However, the pros vastly, vastly outweigh the cons in those cases. You will learn a lot more than you will have to unlearn. That's probably the best way to put it. So if none of those are real pitfalls, then what are the actual pitfalls of using a simulator at home? Well, one of them is chasing the perfect replication of your airplane's systems and panel. Cirrus pilots in particular have a habit of doing this. Not to pick on Cirrus pilots, but I do see it there more often than not, where there is a real fixation on getting the avionics and the panel layout and the seat and the chute all just right. Otherwise, the device has no value. And again, this is not to pick on Cirrus pilots. I suspect it's because the nature of their avionics, they're very sensitive to having differences between the avionics in the simulator versus what's in the airplane. And that is a valid concern. However, if you know that there are differences between the avionics in the simulator and avionics in the airplane, you can adjust for them. And I speak from experience there. I've been using X-Plane since version 5, and they're now on version 12. In fact, 12.1 just went to release candidate. And the Garmin 430, 530, and G1000 have gone through many iterations over the years, all of them slightly different to the real-world hardware. Well, I fly with a effectively Garmin 430. Technically, it's a Garmin 420, but we won't spend time on that. So I quickly realized, okay, that page is different, that page is different, and the number of times it's actually bitten me has been 0 that I know of. I'm here to talk about it today, and I haven't been violated, so I really cannot think of any cases where those differences really caused any significant problem. So I am diligent about reading the manual for my avionics and understanding what's different, and then I move forward from there. So I do believe it's somewhat of a fool's errand to obsess over getting your airplane just right when you can adjust your mindset about the tasks that you're going to train. Now, if you are trying to learn the avionics from absolute scratch, I think in that case that's kind of the Achilles heel of the simulator because now you have laws of primacy and there are some issues there. But if you can focus on other things, there's certainly plenty to focus on other than the buttonology of the autopilot and the buttonology of the specific GPS comm that you're using in the airplane. This one is a big one. So failing to treat your sim like it's an airplane, and when I first wrote that, that felt incomplete because there are times when it's okay to treat a sim like a sim. I don't do run-ups. I do not need to practice run-ups for my airplane. And so there's not much training value to me. When I approach the runway in the sim, I think to myself run up and I think run up complete. So I'm checking the box. I remembered that I needed to do it. I just chose not to actually do it. However, when it comes to decision making as your scenarios unfold, it really is quite important to be thinking that you're in an airplane, or at the very least, you need to make a mental note of when you are departing the realm of what you would have done in the airplane and saying, okay, at this point, I would have done this in the airplane, and I know I could do that to a successful outcome. However, I'm going to choose to do this instead to see where it goes. And that is also okay. Again, just make sure it's a conscious decision if you're going to do something different than what you would have done in the airplane. Otherwise, you run the risk of not realizing a ton of training value if every single thing you do is like the Wild West and you're not really giving it a whole lot of consideration. Um, that can definitely lead to some issues. There's an absolutely massive opportunity after you fly in a sim to spend some time reviewing and debriefing a flight, just like any other real world flight. However, if you do not do that, so let's say you have a bad flight, seen very many people just shut down the sim and walk off in a huff, as opposed to analyzing what it was that happened. Whether they're flying online with an ATC service, whether they're flying by themselves, whether the avionics tripped them up, whether their procedural knowledge tripped them up. Apologies, my headset failed there, but I was able to pause and continue. So whatever it was that had them so freaked out and unhappy, they chose to disengage from the simulator instead of taking the time to actually learn from it. So you do not just magically obtain training value by conducting flights in the simulator. You have to take the time to analyze what your performance was, and reviewing your performance in simulators is actually considerably easier than the airplane in most cases. So a simulator like X-Plane, which is what I choose to use, has fantastic built-in replay capabilities. So I can replay any aspect of the flight for the most part at normal speed, half speed, or quarter speed. I can bring up different views. I can move the camera inside or outside the airplane. I can bring up graphs of what my flight control inputs were to say, okay, what happened there? How did I end up stalling? What was going on with the airplane? So there's a tremendous capability in the simulator, but it's not that tremendous if you choose not to use it. This one's a subtle one, but certainly very common. We see it online all the time. You will see a flight school, for example, that is based at, I don't know, Camarillo, Southern California, or Santa Barbara, or John Wayne. And without fail, 100% of their flights begin at their home airport, regardless of the level of experience of the pilot flying in the simulator. So I understand, again, for primacy or familiarity, there's going to be a temptation to fly at your local airport, and I would actually support that. But shortly after, you should be getting exposed to as many airports as you can, because at some point you become overly familiar with your home airport. You're overbriefed. You know exactly what the frequencies are, how to taxi, what the different taxi routes are, what the sight picture looks like to enter the pattern from any angle to any runway, what all of the instrument approaches are. You're so familiar with it, you then get lulled into a false sense of security up until the point where you have to go to a place you've never been before, and suddenly it feels big and scary. And it shouldn't feel big and scary if you've been to, I don't know, 300 other new places before over the past 5 years of using a simulator, such that when you go to the 301st place, it's not so new and scary. So An actual pitfall would be only flying locally, in which case you should really consider skipping your home airport. Case in point, I never fly, literally never fly at my home airport in Lincoln Park in my simulator unless I happen to have a guest over and they would like to know what my home airport looks like in the simulator. Okay, let's move into some of the general best practices then. So I've gone through the pitfalls, both perceived and actual. So let's now move into general best practices, and then we will, as promised, cover primary and instrument training best practices. This one is a really subtle one, and I have completely failed to do this over the last, I would say, 12 months. And thankfully, I'm flying more than I have in the past. I'm doing more real world flying, so I don't feel too rusty. Um, but this really does sneak up on you. So life gets in the way as a professional working adult. And if you simply sim when you have time, that was a strategy that used to work for me quite well, especially when I was developing training content. I was flying in the sim as part of my job, essentially, and building a company. But when that was no longer the case, my sim usage dropped to close to zero. And I realized then that I had to follow the advice I've been giving other pilots for years who are not in a position where they're having to use the sim for work, which is you need to schedule your sim sessions. You certainly plan out your real world flying. Why not plan out your sim sessions? So if you find that you're not getting into the sim, and again, I know quite a few people who have bought some really, really nice sims and are simply not flying them. And when I speak to them as to why, like I just don't have time. I just do not find myself in the basement flying the sim anymore. So rather than being reactive, they need to be more proactive. We all need to be more proactive about getting serious about scheduling your time in the sim just as you would any other airplane. And do not check email while you're doing the flight. Don't be watching YouTube or doing work. It really needs to be uninterrupted time where it's understood that you're essentially flying and training. Okay, let's talk about different types of flights you can do in the simulator. So there is the traditional use of a sim, I would say, which would fall under skills practice. And then there's less commonly used use of the sim, generally due to time constraints associated with renting sims by the hour, which would be end-to-end flights. So let's look at some examples of specific skills practice. Shorts and softs, both for takeoffs and landings, crosswind landings, power off 180, looking at an ILS approach, really any precision approach, but only from the final approach fix till the DA, or maybe from DA till the missed approach holding point, something like that. Those are examples where you kind of have your blinders on, you're not looking at the big picture, it's not a fully fledged scenario where you have a lot of decision making. This is bread and butter working on a specific skill. These are fantastic uses of the sim. You talk about time efficiency. If you want to go and shoot 6 approaches in the real world, unless you have a very fast airplane and a very accommodating controller, it's going to take time to get the clearance, get the plane in the air, get the clearance, shoot the approach, come back around, shoot the approach again, etc. In a sim, with clever use of saving situations in the simulator, you can literally push one button on a keyboard or joystick if you configure the sim right, and the plane will be at a known location with known weather, a known time of day, and you can conduct that approach until your heart's content. So those are all examples of skills. It's not an exhaustive list, but hopefully you get the idea. So let's look at typical configurations for skills practice. That would be using, say, saved situations, as I was alluding to before. Typically custom weather, so it's a repeatable skill under known conditions, or a repeatable scenario under known conditions, and with plenty of pausing and use of replays. So think of when you are, for example, trying to shoot an approach and you're struggling with what's going on, you may want to pause and take stock of what's happening. Maybe you even watch a replay for the last 30 seconds to see how you got yourself to where you are now. And you can put your thinking cap on. Okay, what am I going to do? Fix it. I need way more power that I got configured early and we have a headwind. I need to add some power. I'm below the glide slope. I'm going to need to add a lot of power to arrest the descent and join the glide slope. And then I'll be back to a reduced power setting compared to this afterburner style setting that I have now. So that's an example where you might use pausing and then continue on with a flight. That's all completely valid and very traditional. Less traditional, but also very valid, is the use of end-to-end flights. So cold and dark at one airport to cold and dark at another, or at least starting on the ground at one airport and starting on the ground and finishing on the ground at the other. Perhaps not cold and dark if you're not really interested in the startup sequence for the airplane. This is a great time to consider the use of real-world weather for a more dynamic experience, and to bring in tools like ForeFlight on an EFB, where looking at the weather for the flight becomes just like doing it for real airplane. So you're conditioning your brain to go through that briefing experience, and then what you're seeing in ForeFlight is going to match what you're seeing in the simulator. So that would be an example of a very different approach to using the sim. Same simulator, same software, but a different use case, and then bringing to bear different tools or configurations to make that happen. Okay, let's look at some general best practices when it comes to VR. I'll keep this fairly quick just for time here. Historically, these have been great for formation flying, aerobatic work, and pattern work. For formation aerobatics, it's fairly obvious. You're out the window with a very dynamic view, and same thing with pattern work. Pattern work in a real airplane requires quite a bit of head movement. I would argue that it's very predictable head movement though, and I have had no trouble whatsoever configuring my non-VR sim at home to do pattern work. So with careful use of views, quick look views in the case of X-Plane, and I know Microsoft Flight Sim has something similar as well, it is possible to conduct pattern work without VR. But let's talk about where VR really can become challenging. Sorry, there's a typo here. It's the manipulation of buttons and knobs. This should say in. Here we go, I'll change that for you. So button and knob manipulation is definitely challenging in traditional VR. I had experience working with the DoD when they first brought in VR sims, and again, aerobatics and formation work, absolute thumbs up. Where the wheels really came off was watching the students try to manipulate the various knobs and buttons in a T6 Texan using a laser pointer essentially on a VR hand device while they're flying in VR. They had trouble reading some of the gauges, and they definitely had trouble manipulating them. And really, it's more trouble than it's worth when it comes to instrument work, in my estimation. Now, things are improving with the advent of mixed reality, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it here, but go look it up and see how mixed reality is allowing you to see your hands and manipulate real hardware. For example, if you have a real SimGear device, that wonderful device is really hard to use if you're wearing a normal VR headset or a full VR headset. But with mixed reality and pass-through, you can see your hand, you can see the device, and it's displayed in context in an otherwise VR scene. So you get all the benefits of being able to look around, combined with the benefits of seeing your hands and being able to manipulate buttons and knobs. But mixed reality is somewhat in its infancy. So for traditional VR, I would say good for the things listed above, but pretty quickly you outgrow it or run into its limitations. And I think it actually introduces more trouble than it solves. And certainly from a configuration standpoint, very, very frustrating. There's about a billion things that can go wrong when using VR with your sim. Okay, let's talk about what it is you should be doing in your simulator. And there's two schools of thought. Do you want to train ahead of your current experience level, or do you want to just stick with what you've been taught? So if you're a primary student, and you haven't been taught shorts and softs, should you learn them yourself? I can't answer that for you. But with every task that it is you're going to practice, there's a difference between practicing a particular task that you've already been briefed on professionally by CFI and have tried in the airplane, and now you're just honing in the sim, versus trying something that you have not formally been taught or tried yet in the airplane, and now you're doing it for the first time in the sim, potentially alone. For primary training, there's certainly more risk. That's the perception of doing too much new stuff on your own. For instrument, it is incredibly common for pilots to essentially self-teach themselves massive amounts of IFR work, and then they go to a traditional flight school to effectively finish off the training, even though by letter of the law, they're actually just starting their training. They arrive pretty much hitting the ground running with very few bad habits to clean up. Um, there's countless, literally hundreds of people that I've come across over the years that have used IFR training to use the home simulator to train ahead of where they are. So there are laws of primacy, there's issues with negative training, but again, if you have an open mind and your instructor has an open mind, everyone's on the same page, you look for those cases where there is a gap in your procedural knowledge or a full-on mistake in your procedural knowledge. But again, you usually generally end up ahead overall. Okay, just looking at the time here, looking at best practice when it comes to thinking about the layers of a simulator. That's the best way to prepare yourself if you're just getting started in simulation. You can start with a basic home sim. You can start adding more hardware to it, add more visuals to it, look at things like VR, and then add some layers on top of it. Before we talk about the second and third layers, I just cannot stress how important it is to become absolutely rock solid in using the simulator itself in its most basic form. So you need to be able to load your simulator up. You need to know how to start it and stop it, how to set the weather, how to position the airplane, how to know where you are on the airport, how to choose the avionics package and airplane that you want. These sound like basic things, but if you don't know how to do them just like that, you will become frustrated as you get lost in different menus and not know exactly where you are. So it all starts with that solid foundation of knowing how to use the simulator properly. So how to look around, how to manipulate the buttons and knobs. If it's got your concentric knobs, big knob, small knob, and the cursor button, like on a Garmin 430, 530, how are you going to make that happen in your simulator? So it's really important to understand the sim at that very, very basic level. It is a problem to try and move on to really hardcore simulator usage and increasing your integration with third-party services and EFBs if you don't actually know how to operate your own simulator. So start with that first level, make sure you master it, and then move on to things like EFB integration. And should you integrate with an EFB? Well, if you fly with one in real life, you absolutely should be looking at that. So X-Plane out of the box does integrate with ForeFlight, and I know for Microsoft Flight Sim, there are third-party add-ons for very low cost, which will also effectively do the same thing. But that becomes really important because now you can do a lot more with that EFB than just using it offline when it's not connected essentially to an airplane. So things like the Glide Advisor in ForeFlight really only comes to life when it thinks you're in an airplane. The AHARs, the synthetic vision showing traffic and terrain and the attitude of the airplane, again, can't do that if it's not connected to a live source. So you can really get the most out of your EFB training if you've got it connected to a sim. I will spend just a minute here on ATC integration. So this is a fairly important part of using a simulator, simply because ATC communication is a fairly important part of flying an airplane. Obviously for IFR, completely critical. For VFR, less so. It depends on the nature of the flight. But there's a few different options out there. And just for reasons of time, I will not go through them in detail, but there is Pilot Edge, which is our company. There is VATSIM, which is a fantastic volunteer network that's been around for a very long time, longer than Pilot Edge, certainly. And there are up-and-coming networks like, say, Intentions, which are leveraging AI really strongly to provide a synthetic ATC experience. And I think I'll leave it at that for now, just for reasons of time. But just understand that there are different ATC services that can be integrated with different pros and cons. Okay, let's look at best practices for primary training, and I will have to move this along as we need to get this published to go live with SimVenture wrapping up in just a little bit the first day. So real quick, pattern work is tricky. If you're not that familiar with the simulator, I would not start with pattern work. I'd set yourself up for a win by doing departures and straight-in arrivals. and really get to know the airplane quite well while it's in the air. Do not feel pressured to jump in a sim that you've never flown, that you barely know how to use, and expect to be able to do pattern work properly. Because pattern work without a VR headset really exposes, it's like the Achilles heel of traditional use of a simulator, simply because it's difficult to call the 45, for the downwind to base, and it's difficult to call the base to final turn as well without a couple of tricks to adjust the view. Practicing four forces, again, limited. If you've spent enough time doing it in the airplane, you can effectively do it in the sim by using kind of muscle memory and looking for certain clues, but I certainly wouldn't try and learn it in the sim first and then in the airplane. There's just a distinct lack of feel that is going to make it difficult. So I'm starting with the difficult ones where simulation is not so great. There are, again, stick and yoke limitations. My advice there is to abandon what your muscle memory is for the real airplane and treat it like an autopilot does. So autopilots have no expectations how an airplane flies. They are looking for an outcome to happen. They apply an input, they measure the response, and then they adjust the input. Just like when you jump into that rental car, you gently hit the gas and see how the plane responds. It's exactly how autopilots generally fly. That's what you should do when you are grabbing a piece of consumer-grade equipment that is not the yoke of your Cessna 172. Okay, moving quick. Pilot edge cross countries, engine out procedures. Do them. They work great. Normal landing and short approaches all work great. Crosswind landings varies from sim to sim. I wouldn't learn them in the sim first. I'd do them in the airplane first and then see how the sim stacks up. ATC interaction for tower and en route. Not a traditional use of the sim, but with those services that I mentioned earlier, you can actually meaningfully practice a task which is very, very poorly taught in the real world. ATC interaction does just not get enough training, enough focus during primary training. And let's finish on one which is really not a good use of the sim for primary training, which would be steep turns. Talk about something which is, the feel of the airplane and how your butt feels in the seat. Really, really difficult to learn steep turns in a sim. Now, can you do it in the airplane first, get pretty good at it, and then really practice it in the sim? Yes, but I would not do it in the other order. Okay, let's look at best practices for instruments. Why are so many pilots afraid to use their rating? Darn it. This is an area I'm very passionate about. So newly minted instrument pilots, that's a typo, are pretty good at shooting approaches, but not much else. So they lack the confidence to actually fly end to end in the National Airspace System because their training has largely been focused, at least in my estimation, on approaches and partial panel. Partial panel has very little relevance in this day and age, and there's a lot more to instrument flying than shooting instrument approaches. So because of the lack of exposure to flying in the system during their instrument training, they don't have the confidence to actually use it in the real world. So to meaningfully practice IFR in the sim, you need ATC to achieve full fidelity of the environment. Without that ATC interaction, meaningful ATC interaction, you really can't do a whole lot that has much fidelity other than going from the final approach fix to a decision altitude out to a missed approach point. Typically where ATC is largely leaving you alone in a GA airplane. And there's a lot more to instrument flying than that short segment right there. So you really do need to have ATC when it comes to instrument flying. You have to deal with things like route changes or how to handle a system failure in the airplane in the instrument environment and 1,000 other unexpected situations. The thing that's tripping people up when they fly instruments in real life is typically not the stick and rudder aspect of it. It's usually the procedural aspect. And so there is a great opportunity there to be practicing that in the sim and really master it. So wow, I was really hoping this would be about 45 minutes. I realize this was a lot to take in, but let's try and wrap up the key points. So the whole goal here is to build up a body of relevant experience. So remember that analogy of the student versus the ATP. Simulators can conveniently build that experience for way less dollars than doing it in the airplane. Um, Not just for way less dollars, but there's simply more you can achieve in the simulator than you can in an airplane. There are some things where you can learn from doing things that are actually quite risky that you really wouldn't want to do in the airplane. You need to familiarize yourself with the different layers of your simulator and understand there are different layers that can be applied to your simulator experience. And by building that layered stack, you'll then have the most well-rounded experience and get the most value from your simulator to take you from that student to ATP level. Thanks for your time. Check out pilotedge.net for more info, and happy flying.